This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and it's Wednesday. That means it's time for another deck history video. In this series, I look at the history of deck archetypes that have been successful at Magic's highest level of competition, starting from the beginning of the game and ending with the modern day. Each week I run a poll to let the viewers decide the topic of the next week's video, and this time around, Eldrazi won pretty handily. By the way, there's a poll on the community tab right now where you can vote on next week's topic. Anyway, at one time or another, Eldrazi have been competitive in Standard, Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, and in this video we'll take a look at the notable iterations of that deck over the years, examining how Eldrazi decks changed over time and why. Eldrazi were first introduced, fittingly enough, in 2010's Rise of the Eldrazi. It was the third set in Zendikar block. The first two sets, Zendikar and Worldwake, felt like a typical fantasy adventure and treasure seeker setting, but it turned out that the plain Zendikar had a deep, dark secret, and that was that the Lovecraftian, powerful, interdimensional, non-color-aligned creatures known as Eldrazi were imprisoned there. Suffice it to say, these monstrous creatures were awakened, so Rise of the Eldrazi was a big departure from the first two sets in the block. Most of the Eldrazi introduced in Rise of the Eldrazi were hugely expensive, but powerful creatures. Arguably, some of the most powerful creatures in the entire game in a vacuum, with Emrakul the Aeon's Torn being the most famous example. Eldrazi found some success in the Standard of 2010 almost immediately, most notably in Love Jance's Eldrazi Green deck, which top-8'd Worlds in 2010. The deck was mainly a mono-green ramp deck that wasn't super heavy with Eldrazi synergy, but it did seek to use Eldrazi Temple and Eye of Ugin to power out big, scary Eldrazi. Eye of Ugin reduces the cost of Eldrazi by 2 and could even tutor them up, and Eldrazi Temple could be tapped to produce 2 mana for Eldrazi spells. That is some serious ramp and would go on to be a defining feature of many future Eldrazi decks. This Eldrazi-focused ramp could be used to power out the powerful Eldrazi, like Emrakul and Ulamog. It also had some other ways to cheat them and other large creatures into play, like with Summoning Trap. This would be the only time an Eldrazi deck got a top 8 in Standard as a result of those Eldrazi printed in Rise of the Eldrazi, though, and for a long time, Eldrazi went pretty quiet. However, eventually, Eldrazi Temple and Eye of Ugin would be utilized again in competitive Magic. The next trip to Zendikar is what really allowed for Eldrazi to return to the center stage. The return to the plane was featured in a 2-set block that featured 2015's Battle for Zendikar and 2016's Oath of the Gatewatch. These two sets still had huge, imposing Eldrazi creatures, like new versions of Ulamog and Kozilek. However, it wouldn't be these Eldrazi that would lead to the creation of new Eldrazi decks in multiple formats. Instead, it was Eldrazi with much lower mana costs than those of their predecessors, like Thought-Knot Seer and Reality Smasher, that made this possible. Thought-Knot Seer had an efficient body and a powerful disruption effect, and Reality Smasher came with very efficient stats along with great keywords, while it also came with an ability that made it very hard for your opponent to ever get more than a 2-for-1 against it. Instead of first emerging as a force in Standard, Eldrazi first showcased how powerful they had become in Modern at Pro Tour Oath of the Gatewatch in 2016. This event would usher in a period in Magic known as Eldrazi Winter. This was a period where Eldrazi utterly dominated Modern for a couple of months in 2016. Turns out, if you took the game plan of that Standard Eldrazi deck of 2010 we talked about first, and instead used those lands to just cast the new, smaller Eldrazi, you ended up with an absolutely absurd Eldrazi aggro deck. 6 of the top 8 decks at Pro Tour Oath of the Gatewatch were Eldrazi aggro decks, and while there was some variation, one thing all the different decks at that Pro Tour had in common was utilizing Eye of Ugin, Eldrazi Temple, and the new cheaper Eldrazi from Battle for Zendikar block. Here's an example of what the first few turns could look like for an Eldrazi aggro deck in Modern. Turn 1, you can play Eye of Ugin and then Eldrazi Mimic. Turn 2, you play Eldrazi Temple and play Thought-Knot Seer. And turn 3, you play any other land and you play Reality Smasher. That is a highly effective first few turns that could do absolutely massive amounts of damage in a hurry, and it was just too much for most Modern decks to deal with, especially with Thought-Knot Seer coming down and taking away anything that might have helped opposing players deal with the situation. The deck could be even faster than that too, once you add in fast mana like Simian Spirit Guide. Those modern Eldrazi decks dominated the format in February and March, but by April of 2016, Eye of Ugin was banned and the deck became significantly less dominant. So that covers 2016's Eldrazi Winter. We aren't done with Modern and Eldrazi just yet. We'll come back to the format later in this video to see what kind of decks emerged in the wake of the Eye of Ugin bannings. But for now, we're going to take a look at other formats around the same time. While Modern was the first format to be impacted by the new Eldrazi of Battle for Zendikar block, it wasn't the only one. Let's take a look at Eldrazi tribal decks and other formats that sought to take advantage of these new Eldrazi. In the Standard of 2016, an Eldrazi-focused deck did not initially emerge as a result of Battle for Zendikar block. After all, Standard didn't have access to Eye of Ugin and Eldrazi Temple. But more Eldrazi did appear in Shadows over Innistrad block that same year, and many of them came with the Emerge mechanic. Eldrazi with Emerge could reduce their cost if you sacrificed a creature when you cast it, and they usually gave you some powerful effects, like Elder Deepfiend, who could be flashed in and was capable of tapping down several key permanents. The plan was to sacrifice creatures that gave you value when they died, like Matter Reshaper. While these decks weren't heavy with Eldrazi synergy, there was one big exception to that, and that was the inclusion of Kozilek's Return. Kozilek's Return is an expensive pyroclasm at instant speed when you cast it from your hand, but if you cast a big Eldrazi spell and it's in your graveyard, you get a more powerful effect that does 5 to all creatures, and that would wipe the board in most cases, and then your Eldrazi would just resolve on a clear board, usually allowing you to take over the game. It also utilized Sanctum of Ugin, which is not technically an Eldrazi payoff, but it effectively is. If you cast a big creature like Elder Deepfiend, you could just search up another big creature. This gave the deck the ability to just keep throwing haymakers by casting big Eldrazi. Emerge was really the only highly successful Eldrazi deck during the time that Battle for Zendikar and Shadows over Innistrad block were legal in Standard. Legacy was also impacted by the new Eldrazi of 2016. While Eye of Ugin got banned out of Modern, that wasn't the case in Legacy, and Eldrazi aggro decks were largely ported into Legacy, where they could still use the Eye and Eldrazi Temple together. That goes a long way towards showing just how strong those modern Eldrazi Winter decks were, as they could basically just compete in Legacy. Now, Legacy Eldrazi decks were more consistent. They could run a third land that added extra mana, like Ancient Tomb. Legacy Eldrazi decks also had a bit more of a disruptive bent to them, utilizing not only Chalice of the Void, but also Thorn of Amethyst to make the opponent's life difficult, while you played out huge Eldrazi turn after turn. These artifacts were basically one-sided, as the Eldrazi aggro deck really wasn't affected by the tax effects, and didn't tend to run 1 mana cost cards that the Chalice would often counter. Eldrazi aggro decks have remained pretty much unchanged in Legacy to this day, as they continue to have a core of cheaper, efficient Eldrazi, Eldrazi Temple, Eye of Ugin, Ancient Tomb, and some disruptive artifacts like the Chalice and the Thorn. Eldrazi decks with this kind of core have even found some success in the most powerful format of them all, Vintage. The one major difference is that most Vintage Eldrazi decks don't run Eye of Ugin. With the Power 9 available, it doesn't tend to be necessary, and they trade it in for other powerful lands that are legal in the format, like the aforementioned Ancient Tomb, as well as Tolarian Academy and City of Traders. The deck is a bit less Eldrazi focused than those in other formats, but the way the deck plays out is still very similar. Lots of scary Eldrazi come down quickly, with various artifacts disrupting the opponent's game plan. Like in Legacy, Vintage Eldrazi decks haven't changed much over the last several years, apart from the fact that Thorn of Amethyst got restricted in 2017, but there have been enough other taxing artifacts, like Sphere of Resistance, to pick up the slack. So that pretty much concludes the discussion of Eldrazi decks in Standard, Legacy, and Vintage. In the latter two, Eldrazi continue to be a major player. They are largely powered by Battle for Zendikar block Eldrazi and fast mana. Now, let's return to Modern, where 3 different Eldrazi variants have ultimately emerged since the banning of Eye of Ugin in early 2016. One of these was simply a continuation of Eldrazi aggro, but without Eye of Ugin. A good example of this is Andre Metzger's Grand Prix Lille deck, which lowered the curve significantly since it no longer had Eye of Ugin, but there were still plenty of powerful aggressive things the new Eldrazi deck could do. The Eye was replaced with mana dorks like Birds of Paradise and Noble Hierarch, so the deck was still reasonably fast at powering out scary Eldrazi. Still, this deck was nowhere near as powerful as its predecessor, and it never really caught on as the primary Eldrazi deck in Modern. Another of these variants was called Eldrazi and Taxes. There's long been an archetype in Magic called Death and Taxes, and this is a deck that usually tends to run a bunch of hate bears that tax the opponent, like Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. Basically, it's an aggro deck that can significantly disrupt the opponent, allowing you to win before they stabilize. Eldrazi and Taxes is pretty much the same idea, except you throw in Eldrazi Temple and run disruptive Eldrazi like Thought-Knot Seer. One of the other key Eldrazi for this deck is Eldrazi Displacer, which can be used to rebuy into the battlefield abilities or disrupt the opponent. Eldrazi and Taxes decks haven't been massively successful in Modern or anything, but they are an Eldrazi variant that emerged in the wake of the Eye of Ugin banning, and one that did find at least some success. The other Eldrazi variant, which has gone on to more long-term success, is Eldrazi Tron. These decks effectively fused what was left of the Eldrazi aggro deck with Tron decks. Tron decks utilize the 3 Urza lands to produce 7 colorless mana with only 3 lands. That's already something that does a good job of quickly casting powerful Eldrazi, but Eldrazi Tron decks also added Eldrazi Temple to the mix, giving them a 4th land that allowed them to add a whole bunch of mana. Eldrazi Tron decks can easily power out a Reality Smasher or Inbringer by turn 3, and that's pretty challenging to deal with. Eldrazi Tron would go on to become the primary Eldrazi deck in Modern, where it's still regularly played today. So in short, Eldrazi didn't become a consistently successful archetype until the printing of new, cheaper Eldrazi in Battle for Zendikar block. These new powerful creatures, especially Thought-Knot Seer and Reality Smasher, combined with easily accessible fast mana, allowing Eldrazi to be dominant in multiple formats. Right now, Eldrazi decks are still in the top tiers of Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, and while some new cards printed in Modern Horizons 2 might make things a little more difficult for Eldrazi Tron in Modern, I'm still reasonably confident that Eldrazi are going to continue to be a fixture at the highest level of competition going forward. Well, that's the history of Eldrazi decks. Just a reminder, there is a poll on the community tab where you can help choose the topic of next week's video, so don't forget to vote. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on some of my other videos, including other deck histories, as well as MTG top 10s that look at the game's history, you should see some playlists on your screen now. Thanks for watching.